Okay, welcome to our fourth in the series of lectures. As usual, we want you to shut off all your electronic devices. That includes laptops, so we would like you to pay attention. So no laptops, cell phones, PDAs, whatever you have out there. Our next presentation will be after break, November 6th. So you have quite a spell before you have to go to the next lecture. I would like to say, though, we do have a very special lecture next Friday, same time. Not part of the Boardroom Insights series, but if you're interested in coming to it, send me an email and I'll tell you who the speaker is going to be and what the topic is. Again, a reminder, just in case you haven't looked at the website recently, we do have our seventh speaker. It will be on November 13th, and it's the president of our Business Advisory Council, Roxanne Martino, who is a hedge fund manager. Make sure you fill out your cards, and then when you turn them in and you leave, we want to give you credit for making your attendance today. Today we have Pat Ward. Pat has held a number of finance leadership positions in the Cummins company. It's a company locally here in Indiana, a town called Columbus. You may not have heard of them, but they are in the Fortune 500, the number 206 in the Fortune 500. Pat has been there for around 20 years. He started in 1987 as a member of the finance team for the Cummins Generator Technologies. In 95, he moved to fuel systems business as a controller. In 96, he joined the corporate finance as director of management and information analysis. In 98, he became the director of finance information technology in Consolidated Diesel Company. In 2000, he was named executive director of controller for Cummins Filtration, then known as Fleet Guard. In 2003, he was executive director of power generation. In 2005, he served as executive director, engine business controller. In 2006, he was named vice president of engine business controller. In 2008, was appointed as vice president and chief financial officer. And I forgot to ask him this question. I know I'm going to mispronounce this. He has his MBA from, is it Strathclyde? Strathclyde. Graduate Business School in Scotland. In 1981, accounting degree from Dundee College of Commerce in Scotland. He is also an associated member of the Chartered Institute of Management Accountants in the United Kingdom. He is married to his wife Diane, 24 years, has two children, Daniel and Caitlin. Daniel is at this point right now a senior in high school, and he is actually on campus going around. He may be joining you as a member of the Notre Dame community next year. He's considering Notre Dame for his institution. Just one more small point. Mr. Ward also has dual citizenship. He is from the United Kingdom and the United States. Mr. Pat Ward.
Good morning. Come on. That's a wee bit subdued. Good morning. Okay, thank you. First of all, I apologize. I have a cold, so if it's difficult to understand me with the accent, it's going to be magnified by the fact I'm choked with this cold. It is a pleasure to be here. Andy Pajikowski, who's sitting near the front here, is in our corporate recruiting group, and he asked me if I would come and talk about business at Cummins, 3 or 4 months ago, Andy? And I was very excited to do so. I think this is a terrific establishment. I came here for the first time last October when my son was starting to look at colleges. There's definitely a special feel about the campus and about the school. So it's a privilege to be back. You have some fine weather up here as well, by the way, a little bit wet today. But my dad's Irish. Okay, I'm Scottish. My dad's Irish. And my dad would always kind of look at the rain and say, fine weather for the garden. And the kids would kind of look at him thinking, what the hell are you talking about? So it kind of felt like that today as we were walking around campus. One of the things I do encourage you as we go through these slides is don't wait until the end to ask questions. Okay, the more interactive we can make this, the more questions that you fire at me, the more interesting and I think enjoyable it's going to be for you and certainly for me. So you don't have to heckle, but you can certainly fire questions any point through the presentation, and we'll stop and take that. So I think the whole series of Boardroom Insights is a terrific idea. I think having executives from various companies in the US come here and talk to you about what they talk about in their boardrooms and their executive committee sessions gives you a sense of what's really happening out there. You get a sense of some of that from the textbooks. You'll get a sense of some of that from the case studies that you do. But it's different. It's different when you're dealing with an issue that could be a significant challenge to the company. Could also be a significant opportunity to the company. So one of the things I want to talk about today is the subject of international trade, or free trade. Okay? It's something that in my company, and by the way, how many people, before you did any pre-reading, how many people knew of Cummins? Okay. So I'm going to spend a few moments as we go through the pack just giving you a little bit of how we've evolved over the last 90 years. But one of the things that we talk about constantly in our company is free trade, access to free trade, the concerns that we have with some of the populist rhetoric that you hear from Washington, from labor unions, or from other groups who genuinely have concerns about free trade, who are genuinely concerned for their workforce, for their employees, for their companies, or for their communities. Okay, so there's a lot of pressure you certainly hear at this point in an economic cycle, where we're facing, or we're in the middle of the severest recession that probably any of us can remember, which exacerbates the issue. Okay, as a company, Cummins, like many others in the US, take this subject very, very seriously. It's very important, not just to our success, but just to survive. And earlier this week in the Wall Street Journal, Monday's Wall Street Journal, there was an article on the opinion page. Now, I don't always agree with the editorials or opinions of the Wall Street Journal, but this one I think they got it spot on. So let me just read a couple of paragraphs that I think help set the stage for what I'm going to talk about for the next hour or so. The last time the prospects for free trade looked as bleak as they do now, flapper skirts were in style. The World Trade Organization's Doha round of global trade talks is so bogged down that it barely rates a mention anymore. In the past 9 months, the US has started trade firefights with China and Mexico in the name of fairness, while Congress sits on free trade deals with South Korea, Colombia, and Panama. Meanwhile, countries around the world are experimenting with sneaky forms of protectionism, including buy local campaigns, licensing restrictions, and safety standards so draconian that no competitor can meet them. And then towards the end of the opinion page, it talks about the victims who suffer most in trade conflicts are the average consumers who, of course, are also workers. As countries throw up barriers to trade, consumers pay higher prices for imported products. Export-oriented businesses suffer. Job-creating foreign investment is discouraged. And the global trading system that moves capital and goods efficiently from one country to another runs the risk of entering a downward spiral, as it did in the 1930s. So this is some of the material that you will read, and you'll read counter-arguments to that, which are also, you can argue, are valid. So what I want to do this morning is start with the big picture. Start with some of the history behind free trade, talk about some of the facts, the data that's out there, and then I want to get very specific about Cummins, about how it impacts our company in the past, how it's impacting our company today, and what it could do to Cummins in the future. And then I'm going to wrap up with some of my own comments as to what I think we need to be doing next to work our way through this. But again, if you have questions at any time, please ask. So it's not a new argument. Okay? The debate about free trade being good or bad for the US is not new, and nor is it confined to the US. The World Trade Organization, by the middle of 2009, had identified 30 countries around the world who had implemented or were implementing restrictive free trade practices. Those who have concerns about free trade, as I said a few moments ago, they do so because they are genuinely concerned for their communities and for their employees and for their companies. They don't do it out of spite against another country. Okay? Part of the argument that's going on just now is like, someone's right and someone's wrong. It's not as simple as that. Okay? We really need to start to listen to each other and to talk through some of these issues. Alexander Hamilton, who you all know was the first US Secretary of State, he was a fierce advocate of tariffs to protect infant industries. Abraham Lincoln, very much in the same vein, implemented a 44% tariff during the Civil War, again, in part to protect industries in the North, in part to pay for the war effort. And you can look back and kind of say, well, it worked. I mean, the North were clearly stronger economically, and that no doubt helped them win that particular conflict. And more recent events include increasing tariffs on imported tires from China, which you've been reading about in the last 4 or 5 weeks, and the Buy America initiative, which is part of President Obama's economic stimulus program. So again, I don't think people are trying to be malicious. I don't think people are trying to discriminate. I think they're really trying to look after people who they care about. On the other hand, there's a history of civilizations who have prospered through free trade. Adam Smith, Scots guy, 18th century Scottish economist, was a passionate supporter of free trade. Okay, he was very skeptical about any government intervention. Okay, and he gave examples of various countries who had flourished as a result of endorsing and supporting free trade practices. The Netherlands, back in the 17th and 18th century, a really small European country, whose population today is not that much bigger than Scotland, were a major seafaring and economic powerhouse back at that time. Okay? They established colonies and trading ports, trading establishments all around the world, and became one of the dominant players in that 17th, 18th century period. Okay? It probably was the first real capitalist country on the planet. And Amsterdam at the time was definitely the wealthiest trading center on the planet. So that's some of the counter-arguments to those who are opposed to free trade. More recently, in the 1930s, the 1930 Tariff Act, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, increased tariffs on 20,000 imported products. And again, this was in response to the weakening labour markets of the late 1920s. It was in response to difficulties faced by farmers and the intent to increase domestic companies' market share. So they increased tariff rates on agricultural and industrial goods. President Hoover at the time, who started off supporting some of those measures, quickly changed his position when he seen the extent of the tariff plan being proposed. He was very concerned about the reaction that was going to cause from the US's trading partners at the time. Okay, nevertheless, it went through Congress, it was implemented, and initially it appeared to be a great success. Factory payroll started to increase, industrial production started to increase. However, Hoover was right. At the end of the day, he was right. Because ultimately, the resulting retaliatory actions from the US trading partners caused US exports to drop by more than 50%, which some people would argue exacerbated the severity of the Great Depression. There's also a perception that protectionism has been a major cause, or was a major cause, leading to war and to conflict. Frédéric Bastiat, who was a 19th century French political economist, who actually wrote some really witty, satirical narratives on protectionism. This was one of his more serious ones, where he talks about when goods cannot cross borders, armies will. Like Adam Smith, deeply suspicious of central government intervention in economic matters. His central theme was that all economic decisions should be made with the consumer in mind, and that all that tariffs did was to negate the gains provided to society from those benefits from free trade, driven by technology or labour or innovation or progress. And just before the Second World War, even in Europe, although the tariffs were not as stringent as what they were in North America, various nations had tariffs against each other. Okay? Germany, which was at the heart of Europe, still is at the heart of Europe, was feeling very aggrieved at the outcome of the Versailles Treaty after World War I, okay? Was suffering severely economically, had a whole lot of political turmoil going on, and that kind of opened up the door for someone like Adolf Hitler to go in there and do his thing. Okay? In the eyes of the German people, here was someone coming to help them, to raise their position back on the stage. Okay, so you've got to watch what we do in times of economic turmoil, because it might start off like a hell of a good idea. It might feel like the obvious thing to do, but the repercussions, you go back to that example, the repercussions were horrendous. So that's something I think we all have to keep in mind when we engage in these debates. So from a more positive perspective, the arguments for free trade is that it increases growth, it raises living standards across the world, and it brings prosperity for those nations who engage in free trade. The World Bank, over the last quarter of a century, have written that approximately 500 million people have been lifted out of poverty as a result of being more involved in the world economic order. So all good arguments. I think you could definitely argue that creating more competition between producers, between merchants across the world, results in more innovation. Okay? Results in better products being made available on the market. Results in access to new markets. It allows companies to move outside their domestic territory, which is good for their growth. It adds to unemployment. And as you'll see in the Cummins example later on, significantly protects the company from cyclical events. It gives more choice to consumers, you and I, and it lowers costs for consumers. Tremendous opportunities for companies, for us, to benefit when you actually embrace free trade. The global marketplace is really important to the US, so this is obvious. Everyone gets this. The US has 5% of the world's population today. Okay, so that leaves 95% of the market outside these shores. 95% of the market. Okay, if you're going to run a company at some point in the future, okay, you're not going to restrict yourself to 5% of the market. Because if you do, you're going to end up in a terrible situation. Okay, 95% is out with these shores. And although there's a tremendous amount of discussion around trade deficits, I think it's important to keep in mind that last year, before the recession kicked in, we exported $1.8 trillion in exports. A $500 billion increase in the last 4 or 5 years. Now, I get the argument we import more. We imported somewhere around 2.4, 2.5 trillion. Okay? But this is not a small number. And when you look at the trade balance in capital goods, there is no deficit. Okay? The deficit kicks in when you start taking oil into the equation. Okay? But keep in mind, when we start talking about actions to protect US companies and protect US workers, we could be turning off some of this $1.8 trillion of business that we currently do overseas. There's also a concern that free trade hurts US employment, that companies move jobs overseas, and that will lead to growing unemployment right here in the US. As you look at the data and the facts on this, I think another picture arises. If you look over the last 9 or 10 years, US employment levels increased from 129 million people to 138, again, pre the recession that we're currently going through. Likewise, unemployment, if you look at the last 10 years, between 1990, actually the last 15 years, between 1994 and 2008, unemployment's kind of stayed around 5%. Prior to that, in the 15-year period prior to that, somewhere in the 6 to 6.5% range. Okay? Far more international trade going on here. Far more international trade that the US is involved in this time period than there was back here. So unemployment has grown. Unemployment levels across a reasonable length of economic cycle, 15 years, are actually lower than what they were back in the early 80s, all the 80s through to the early 90s. Now, again, unemployment is very high today. So the argument that should come back is, so you're very quiet about unemployment in 2009. 9%, going to end up somewhere around 10.5%, maybe even a little bit more. Okay? It's a valid pushback. Okay? But I think I want to talk about Cummins and a Cummins example that I think addresses that issue. Okay? I think unemployment would actually be far higher today if we were not as involved in the global trading system as we are. But again, I'm happy to take different positions on that. Another point of contention is that US employees are disadvantaged when they have to compete against low-cost, foreign imported products where their employees overseas are being paid less, in some cases much less, than US employees. So isn't that going to cause US wages to go down? Or isn't that going to cause some restriction on the amount of increases that US employees can expect in the future? And as you look at the data, whether you look at the total private sector over the last 9 years, or you just look at the manufacturing sector over the last 9 or 10 years, average weekly earnings are up somewhere in the 30 to 35% range. That's an average increase of about 3% a year, slightly higher than the average CPI inflation index has been over the same time period. In fact, when I was reading up on this last night, I came across some data that talks about employees in the most trade-intensive parts of manufacturing earn, on average, 47% more in their annual compensation than employees who are engaged in the least trade sectors of manufacturing. 47% more. Come on and have a seat. So I think some of the evidence would point to free trade actually helping our position. Productivity. I think the US has clearly met the challenge of lower cost competition by increasing output per hour worked. I think the innovation of the US is second to none. I think that's clearly been established over the last 25, 50 years. There's a concern that we're not investing as enough as what we should be doing just now, and certainly compared to some Asian countries, we are not investing at a fast enough rate. But at the moment, we're kind of hanging in there. And if you look at the average annual growth rate, again, over this time period, the last 15 years, we've grown output, we've grown productivity by somewhere around an average of 5% a year. Okay, that's good. That's our response to international competition. That's good for us being the consumer. Okay, you compare it to the previous, 15 years, and it was somewhere in the 3 to 3.7% range. It's still a reasonable growth rate, but I think the US has risen to the challenge that it's seen from international trade, coming in and being a threat, a competitive threat, which we've turned into an opportunity to improve productivity. So that's some of the big picture highlights. And again, I know there's facts out there you could throw back at me and say, well, what about this particular instance? What I want to do now is talk specifically about Cummins. Okay? Cummins Inc. was founded in 1919, down the road, down I-65, Columbus, Indiana. It's a small town. It's kind of sleepy small town. Has a population of, 35 to 40,000. There's 2 high schools. It's not the place you'd expect to see a major Fortune 500 company. Okay? But the company has grown into that. It was founded back in 1919 by 2 gentlemen, Plessy Cummins, so the name clearly comes on from Plessy. He was the technical brains. He was the engineer behind this. And W.G. Irwin, who was a local banker, who Plessy Cummins used to work for. He was the man who put the financial resources into the company. This picture that you see on the bottom right-hand side of the screen was the original manufacturing location. It's still the company headquarters today. This building here is still there. Now, we've obviously grown beyond that, but the company has stayed very committed to its roots. In 1929, after 10 years of making no money, the company designed and developed a diesel car, the first diesel car in North America. And it then completed an 800-mile trip from from New York to Indianapolis. Cummins went 18 years without making any profit. That would never happen today. Okay? It was only because of the commitment of W.G. Irwin to the project that he continued to sustain investment to keep the company going through its very formative years. So I'm going to go through some pictures, because I thought they were actually quite nice pictures when I went through them, just to give you a sense of how the company's evolved over the last 90 years and how we've kind of moved into different markets. So I know there's some mechanical engineers in the audience here. Hopefully this will be of interest to you. 1931, 2 years later, from the previous picture, a Cummins diesel-powered truck went coast to coast. From New York to Los Angeles in 97 hours, a record time at that particular point, at a cost of $11 in fuel. It's a hell of a deal, $11 coast to coast, which I think back then clearly displayed the benefits of diesel over gasoline, which is another subject that I'd love to come back and talk to maybe the engineering people about. It still exists today. Okay, and when we talk about concerns about energy in this country and our dependence on foreign-sourced oil, there's one rather simple solution that we can put into place very quickly if we could move more of our use of energy from oil, from gasoline, to diesel. I mean, the Europeans probably have about 50% of their motor vehicles powered by diesel. If I go back home and hire a car, it's going to be a diesel engine. And it's not like the diesels you've seen back in the 80s here. They're really good cars. So anyway, I digressed a little bit there, but I think it's an interesting subject that we should continue to talk about. It's another one that we talk about in the boardroom quite a lot. By the 1950s, the US had embarked on a massive interstate highway construction program with Cummins engines powering much of the equipment used to build those highways, and also thousands of the trucks that started to roll down those roads. Truckers demanded economy, power, reliability, and durability, and by combining lab-based research and field test trials, we were able to make some significant technology improvements in our diesel engines. We were a significant presence at the Indianapolis 500 race during that period of time. In fact, this picture is when we actually took pole position back in 1952, with at that point in time a track record of 139 miles per hour. By the late 50s, the company, who had been struggling financially for many years, was now $100 million in size and was now starting to make some money. As well as building engines that would move things quickly, it also built engines that could move really big things. So what you see in this picture is a 1972 picture. It's a 700 horsepower diesel engine pulling a huge oil production module in Alaska. So it might be really difficult for the folks at the back of the room, but this is the vehicle that pulls this module. So if I was standing here, I'd be about that size there. Okay, just an enormous weight that these engines could pull along. So as well as speed, we were able to help move very large and very heavy objects. As well as cars and trucks, the diesel engines evolved into other applications. In this case, 4 19-litre diesel engines powered this German intercity train back in 1999 to a record-breaking speed of 138 miles per hour. So now you're starting to see some of the international exposure that we get ourselves into. More recently, our international business has grown at a faster rate than our domestic business. It's really taken off in Asia. Okay? And I'll talk much more about Asia later on, because that's clearly going to be a marketplace for US companies to win and to grow in if we're committed to trade. The example you see here is in China, where back in 1999, the Beijing Public Transit Authority placed an order for 300 natural gas Cummins engines to replace some of their local bus fleet, with the premise being they wanted to clean up air quality. That 300 order has now grown to a fleet of 3,500 engines that we have supplied to the Beijing Transport Authority. We have a very strong relationship with Komatsu. Andy here used to work on the Komatsu account at Cummins. We've built up a strong partnership with them. We have 3 joint ventures. They're based in the US and they're based in Japan. And we put our engines into their mining and construction applications. And again, the picture here really doesn't do justice to the size. I was in South Africa a couple of weeks ago at one of our customers' iron ore mines and seeing this vehicle. It's enormous. So again, for those at the back of the room, that's the height of a person in relation to the whole size of the vehicle. So if you can imagine the engine that's pulling, that's digging these mines, it's quite incredible. At least for a finance guy, it's quite incredible. In 2000, in the UK, we installed our low-emission engines into a 34-year-old London double-decker bus, okay, the big red bus, which made it the cleanest bus in London at that time, despite its age. Okay? If you go to London now, if any of you go to London for vacation, or I think you have a program that also covers London, don't you? If you take one of those big brown buses that goes around the city, the tourist buses, they're all powered by Cummins Euro 5 engines. Okay? So, again, people really don't understand the brand or see the brand that well, but whether it's an on-highway application, an on-highway application, there's a good chance Cummins are going to be powering some of the equipment that you're using. Hybrids, we're moving into hybrids now. Helps demands for lower emissions and fuel economy. In this particular example, we met 2010 emissions back in 2006, 4 years early, reducing fuel consumption and greenhouse gases by over 30%. And lastly, on the picture show, this is in Dubai, the Airbus A380, and we have one of our Cummins, I think it's a 19-litre engine, pulling that pushback tractor, or powering that pushback tractor. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of how we've evolved over those last 90 years. The company has now grown to be $14 billion in size, 2008. I can't talk about 2009. Well, I could talk about 2009, but the SEC would be unhappy with me for talking about 2009. If you want to listen in to our quarterly teleconference, it's coming up in a couple of weeks' time, where we'll talk about third quarter results. But at the end of 2008, the company had a record $14 billion in sales. We had an additional $6 billion in revenues from our joint ventures, half of which is coming from China and India. We are the world's largest independent manufacturer, pardon the spelling here, of diesel engines. Last year, we built nearly 900,000 engines across the world, and more than half of that is manufactured outside the US. And you're going to see in a moment how the company really depends now on its business from overseas. We have a very diverse geographic position, much different from 10 years ago, which is helping the company get through this recession much better than it got through the last recession. These are the applications that we go into now. On-highway trucks, so the big heavy-duty trucks that you see going up and down the interstate. We have 50% of that market share today. We also make engines for medium-duty trucks. We put the engine in the Chrysler Dodge Ram pickup in their largest, in their the 2500 and 3500 series of the Dodge Ram pickup. We have pretty much the bus market in North America to ourselves. So transit buses, you're going to find diesel. If it's a diesel engine, it's going to be a Cummins diesel engine. Off-highway, mining, construction, marine, agriculture, and power generation. So a fairly diverse set of end applications. The company is always associated with the first one. The company is always associated with North American heavy-duty trucks. Okay, go back to the 1950s. We're building out the highway infrastructure, and all these trucks started to come on. We had very, very high market share back then. So even today, if I go out and talk with investors or analysts, they always start off with the North American heavy-duty truck market. And today, for us, it's about 13% of our business. Okay, but that's where we came from. That's where we're always going to be. I want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about core values. I know most speakers that you'll have in front of you will also talk about core values and why it's important to them. It's very, very important to Cummins. We look at core values as our ethical compass. Okay? It's not meant to be a throwaway line. It's not meant to be a kind of phrase that we like to put up in walls around the company. And these are not new. You'll see in a moment a gentleman who really, back in the mid-50s, led Cummins to a very successful period with virtually the same core values I'm going to talk about here. So we have 6. The first one is integrity, that we strive to do what is right, and we do what we say we will do. Okay, I understand your next speaker, either next week or in a fortnight's time, is an ethics compliance officer, and I thoroughly encourage you to go to that discussion, because it's very, very important that companies today are ethical and make sure that throughout their organization ethics are understood and valued as highly as anything else in the business. Okay, very important. Second core value is innovation. Apply our creative ingenuity to make us first to market, to make us the first choice of customers, to make us better, to make us faster. The third core value, very dear to my heart, obviously, is delivering superior results. Okay, results that your stakeholders are going to look for and expect because they're investing money in your company. The fourth one is corporate responsibility. This is a really big deal for Cummins. Supporting communities where we manufacture product around the world. And again, there's enough material here for the subject of another discussion, but we spend a lot of time on corporate responsibility. My predecessor as CFO now heads up the Cummins Foundation, and her job is basically corporate responsibility. If Tim Salsa, chairman, was here, he could talk for hours about corporate responsibility. It's very, very important to us. Diversity, embracing the diverse perspectives of all people and honouring them with both dignity and respect. Be a company that the best people around the world want to work for. And finally, global involvement. Seek a worldview and act without boundaries. And this is exactly what free and international trade is all about. So I'm trying to show a picture here of how our core values come back and lead into and complement the focus on international trade. Now, I said these core values are not new to us. If you read the history of Cummins, you're going to come across a gentleman called J. Irwin Miller at the heart of these values. He was the great-nephew of one of the co-founders. If you remember on an earlier slide, we talked about W.G. Irwin. J. Irwin was the great-nephew of that founder. He was our chairman for just over a quarter of a century, between 1950 and the mid-1970s, and left an indelible mark on the company. Again, I do encourage you at some point, read a little bit about him. He was quite a remarkable individual, very active in civil rights back in the 60s, where Columbus at that time was not necessarily a very welcoming place for the civil rights argument. He kind of took that one on. He took on local friends who ran other companies in the area when the unions were talking about coming to southern Indiana. He encouraged unions to come to southern Indiana to protect the workforce. He wanted to kind of create this relationship of trust. Okay? When he retired, not when he retired, but when he was, let's say, close to being 90 years old, he was honoured by the Diesel Workers Union at one of our annual general meetings, and you could tell just how important that honour was to him. Really quite a remarkable individual, someone who really shaped the company back then and has shaped what we are today. The point I'm trying to get to, though, is that he was a very strong advocate for free trade and for international business. Okay, he established the first Cummins operation outside North America in 1957 in Scotland. Okay? He was the one that kind of took us outside these shores for the first time. Okay? He led Cummins into India in the 1960s, and right after Nixon came back from China in the 70s, he was one of the first businessmen to go to China and to start talking with the Chinese authorities and Chinese business partners as to how Cummins could start to have access to that market. And again, I'll talk more about China and India in a few moments. He was also a passionate supporter of diversity. And the words that you see on the left-hand side here come come from a speech he gave at Oxford University back in the early 80s. And I have them up in my office. The first time I read this, I just felt it was so powerful. Okay? Character and ability and intelligence are not concentrated in one sex over the other, nor in persons with certain accents, or in certain races, or in persons holding degrees from some universities over others. When we indulge ourselves in such irrational prejudices, we damage ourselves most of all, and ultimately assure ourselves of failure in competition with those more open and less biased than ourselves. Okay? It's just a very powerful short paragraph that not only talks about diversity, but when I read it, when I keep reading it, more open, more open, more open. Okay? He wants open markets. He wants free trade. You could see back in the 50s why that was so important to this little company, 200 miles south of here. Okay? Just a terrific visionary. So, today, the company employs 35,000 people across the world. It's a very diverse workforce. About 40% of those employees are based in North America. So we have about 14,000 employees in the US. We have 6,000 employees in Indiana. Okay, so it always has remained the heart of the company. You can see how on the pie chart on the left-hand side, this is how our $14 billion in revenues split up. And I think one of the most notable slices of the pie, the red that you see here, is a slice from US and Canada. US is about 40%, Canada is about 7%. If I had showed you a pie 5 or 6 years ago, this red slice would have come all the way around here. We were far more dependent on the North America market, on the US market in particular, to be successful. Now, the fact that the pie has moved around doesn't mean that US sales have shrunk. Okay, we have continued to grow US sales over the last, between 2003 and 2008, we have grown them. Okay, but we've grown international sales at a faster rate. The picture here, this might be really difficult for the people at the back, so I apologize for that. But all it's intended to do is give you a sense of our physical coverage around the world. So all these dots represent a Cummins operation, a Cummins manufacturing plant, a technical center, a distributor, or a Cummins dealer, or a Cummins service center. So it gives you a sense, I think, of the physical coverage that we have across the world. The supply chain gives us access to low-cost, high-quality global sourcing of products. We ship more products now from other parts of the world than we ever did before, okay? Because they're lower cost, they keep us competitive, and they're very high quality. We have 48 operations around the world. 48, that's engine plants, components facilities, scattered around the world. We have a distribution presence and a service presence in almost 200 countries. We have over 500 distributors and over 5,000 dealers. Okay? So this little business that started off up here, and again, hopefully you can still see a significant piece of the presence is still in Indiana, has now evolved into a much more global company. We have engine facilities in the US. We have them in Columbus, Indiana. We have them in Seymour, Indiana, which is about, 15 miles south of Columbus. We have them in Jamestown, upper state New York. We have them in North Carolina. We have them in South Carolina. And we have them in Texas. In the UK, we have manufacturing plants in Darlington, in the north of England, in Daventry, in the Midlands of England. In China, in Chongqing, which is kind of Midwest China, Shangfang, and in Beijing. In Japan, we have a joint venture with Komatsu. In South Korea, we source very small engines from South Korea. In Pune, in Jamshedpur in India. In Jamshedpur, we have a joint venture with Tata. I think everyone knows who Tata is. Turkey, we license engines with BMC, very strong company in Turkey. And in Brazil and Mexico, we also have had a presence for a number of years and continue to grow that presence in those markets. So that's the engine business. The components business, it makes filters, turbochargers, fuel systems, exhaust after treatment, has a very similar presence all around the world. Okay? We don't do all our exports from the US. We do a fairly significant amount, by the way. Okay? I think there's a slide coming up that talks about $3.5 billion worth of product was exported from the US to other markets around the world in 2008. That's about, 35–40% of our total sales outside the US. So call it a third of what we sell outside the US is manufactured in the US, which I think is a pretty good reason why free trade is helpful for Cummins and its employees and its communities in North America. And this picture just illustrates the number of engines that we make in these different regions around the world. So you can see the US is still the largest, but China's catching up. India's catching up. And I think the point that's important to make here is that we don't go to China and India to make engines to ship them back to the US because they're lower cost. We couldn't do it anyway because the emission standards are much different in China and India. We go to China and India because they have very large markets that we can tap into and grow the company. And again, driving up here last night, I was reading a series of articles, and one of them talked about 75% of US foreign direct investment goes into high-wage countries. 50% goes into Europe. Okay, so the mindset that many of us have is that US companies are moving all their manufacturing to low-cost countries to stay cost competitive. And yet, some of that goes on. But when you actually look at the data, the real reason why Cummins, Caterpillar, Honeywell, and other manufacturing companies like us move to China and move to India and move to Brazil is so we have access to that market. Okay, and we avoid importing, and we avoid importing taxes and duties into those countries. We become a presence. The Cummins brand is actually better known in China and India than it's known in the US. If you drive around Chongqing in the middle of China, okay, it's got a population of 30 million people. When you take Chongqing and surrounding district, 30 million people. You'll drive, and the highway system's fantastic. You drive on these highways and you'll see these big banners across the highway, and it'll be Cummins engines. It'll be a big red ISX engine. So we're much better known in those emerging markets than what we are in our own domestic market. We have built up international partnerships with some very important customers across the world over time. So again, I'm not going to read out all the names, you can see them, but these have been very important to our success in the last 25 years and will be even more important to our future success in the next 25 years ahead of us. So let me talk about the results then. So the question that some of you probably had, yeah, this is a really nice story, nice pictures, I get it. But show me the money. Okay, what difference has it really made to your company? Those of you who studied our history and looked at our financial results will have seen significant cycles where we make money, we lose money, we make money, we lose money. And that's because we were very much dependent on one region, North America, and one market, being the North American heavy-duty truck market. So the board of directors and the executive committee were very clear 10, 15 years ago that even though we had an international presence, we had to extend it. We had to become much less reliant on one market or one country. We had to make investments around the world, which at the time might have been speculative, I mean, we never made any money in China until about 1999. We went in there in the 70s. Okay, so we went through a 15-year period of not making any money in China. We're making a lot of money in China now. Our share of joint venture income from our Chinese joint ventures was $90 million last year. That's 50% after-tax profits. Okay, so those Chinese joint ventures are making somewhere around 225 million earnings before interest and tax. Go back 10 years ago, it was nothing like that. So the company over the last 5 years have really seen the fruits of this international growth. So we've had 5 successive record years of sales, going from $8 billion back in 2004 to $14 billion last year. And our profits, earnings before interest and tax, have more than doubled, going from $543 million to almost $1.3 billion last year. Okay. International trade is not the only reason for this, okay, but it's a really big reason. Okay. It's a really big reason. Cummins would not be the company it is today. In the last recession, back in 2001 and 2002, we lost money. We went between the fourth quarter of 2000 and the first or second quarter of 2002, we lost money for 5 quarters. 5 of those 6 or 7 quarters, we lost money. Okay, we didn't see the type of fall-off that we're actually facing in this current recession. Nothing like it. Okay, in this recession, our sales are going to be down 30% this year. Okay, so this $14 billion number is going to be closer to 10. That's already public information, so I'm not breaching any confidences here. Okay, but a 30% drop in revenues in 1 year. We have never faced that as a company in our history. Okay? Yet the company will still be profitable. The company will still generate cash. And a big part of it is because we've got such a diverse portfolio of businesses across the world in different markets than we ever had before. So although the US, in theory, is coming out of a recession, the third quarter will probably show some very low 0.1%, 0.2% positive GDP, we're still in a recession. Companies like Cummins are still going to see a very flat market in North America, in Europe, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, for the foreseeable future. Unemployment's still going to grow. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But the markets in China are coming back. The markets in India are coming back. And the markets in Brazil are coming back. So having this balance, having this portfolio of different countries that are significant to us has helped us come out of this recession, or to manage through the recession. We've not come out of it. 2008, the record year you see here, 19% return on equity. Almost $1 billion in operating cash in 2008. I already made the comment last year that we exported $3.5 billion worth of product from the US. And much has been made about the so-called outsourcing of America. And it's true that many companies, including Cummins, have looked outside the US for low-cost, high-quality product. And we have to do that to remain competitive. But again, back to what I said before, the real reason we go outside the US is to have access to the marketplace. So a question, has international trade hurt US employees? Has it hurt Cummins US employees? On that last slide, there's a little red line here that you probably can't see, but between 2006 and 2008, our US sales did not grow. All the growth up here was from international sales. Okay, US was flat. At the same time, we increased our US headcount by 1,000 people. We now have 14,000 employees in the US. Okay, so this myth that people continue to perpetuate that international business is driving US jobs overseas, I think companies like Cummins, and not only Cummins, by the way, can show, no, that's not the case. International business is good for US employees and good for US communities. The current recession is difficult. It's one of the most difficult periods that we've had to face as a company in the last 50 years. It's deep. The recession is broad. It has affected all our major markets. Every one of them has been affected at some point in this recession. Some are now starting to come out, as I said earlier on. Unemployment's still going to grow. Okay, we're going to end up 10.5%, maybe even 11% by the time we're done. So consumer spending is not going to be showing any signs of recovery anytime soon. Okay, the housing market remains fairly depressed. Retail spending, I think, has kind of bottomed out, and hopefully is going to start to show a little bit of an upturn soon. But as unemployment grows, that's going to curtail consumers' ability to spend. And commercial lending had slowed to a trickle. I think it's better now than what it was 6 months ago. As we talk with banks about our credit facilities, I think there's been a loosening of what they're willing to advance to companies, but they're being very, very careful about it. We met with one bank in New York a couple of weeks ago. They have a $100 million position in our credit revolver. We have a $1.1 billion credit revolver. It's a 3-year deal that's up for renewal in 2011. So we watch all the banks who have a significant presence in that revolver to determine are they going to be around and willing to support us when we have to renew it. Now, we haven't had to use it yet. Okay, the company's generating cash. We have very little debt. We're in a very strong position. But what I was concerned about with the bank was that I was hearing they were starting to scale down their support of major companies. Okay, and this particular bank told me that that was true, that they had reduced or were in the process of reducing their support of around 70% of the companies in their portfolio. I mean, just an enormous drop. And that's because they have to focus now on a much more select few Tier 1 type companies that they feel their investments are going to be safe with. Okay, so although I think interest rates, if you look at the credit spreads, they have improved over the last few months, it's still a very tight credit market. It's very tight for end users. If we think about truck companies, our end users don't have the credit that they need to go out and buy new trucks. Okay, even though the truck fleets are now getting pretty old, the state of the economy, the credit availability has made it very difficult for them to think about making capital investments. So the question here is that shouldn't we protect US companies and interests with the Buy America program? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with incenting US companies and giving them the opportunity to participate in some of the stimulus support at more favorable terms than companies outside the US? I mean, surely that's not a bad deal for US employees and communities. Our view on that is that, yeah, we should protect US companies and we should protect US individuals, US employees, but not by protectionism. It would be a major mistake if this administration or any other administration was to think that we will give preferential treatment to US companies at the expense of non-US companies. Be very clear on that one. I mean, if we start playing that game, if we start rigging that market, there will be retaliatory pressures. Okay, you're already seeing that from a comment I made earlier on that the WTO has identified 30 countries around the world where people are now starting to look inward. Okay, if we start playing games, as we are, in cutting off access to our markets from foreign companies overseas, you're going to see a replay of the Great Depression. Okay, it will stall the economic recovery because our exports will be reduced. Okay, the number I showed earlier on, $1.8 trillion, they will be endangered. So that's what we are worried about in our company. That's what our board of directors keep asking us. That's why companies are actively involved now in Washington in making sure that our representatives understand what's at stake here. It's all very well to to spout out the rhetoric, but you've got to think about the implications that those actions could actually have. For Cummins, we see significant global opportunities going forward. And I'll go through these fairly fast, just in the interest of time. But we see tremendous opportunities from global emission standards. Okay? The picture you see here is how global emission standards will be enforced across the world over the next 4 or 5 years. Okay? Companies come to Cummins to help them meet these emission standards because we've already done it in the US. The US has by far the much more restrictive emission standards in the world. So it's a huge global opportunity for us and US companies like ourselves. The demand for improved fuel efficiency across the world, people are wanting to figure out ways to use less fuel to power their economies. Okay? It's a global opportunity for the likes of us, for the likes of Caterpillar and others to take advantage of, as long as protectionism doesn't get in the way. The increasing dependence on electric supply. If you look at the growth in the demand for electricity over the last 5, 10 years, it's grown at an average rate of about 4% a year. The supply base has grown at around 2.5% to 3% a year. So you've got this widening gap between the demand for electricity and the supply. Sure, it's narrowed in this recession, so you don't hear so much about it these days. But as we come out of recession, it's going to grow again. And that's where companies like Cummins, with their power generation business, can come in and fill some of that gap. And that business is headquartered in Minneapolis. And finally, the infrastructure and urbanization in emerging markets, in the Chinas, in the Indias, in Africa, around the world, presents another terrific opportunity for us. This is our position in the emerging markets in India and in China. We've been in India, as I said earlier on, for over 40 years, since the early 60s. And we've been in China since the mid-70s. They're going to grow faster than developed Western economies in the future. This is where US companies have to fight the game. Okay, you go back to 2000, and the US exported twice as much into Asia as China. Just back in 2000. Today, it's flipped. Today, China exports twice as much as we do into Asia. It's the fastest growing market on the planet. Okay, and we're not in there. We're not in there fighting as much as what we should be. We've got good businesses in these countries. We've been there for a long time. I think what's attractive about them is that between the two countries, you have 40% of the world population. We think we're really well positioned with the facilities, the relationships we have with major Indian and Chinese companies to grow into the future. Our sales in China last year were I don't know if it's on the chart or not, but $2.3 billion of revenues in China last year. Our sales in India last year, $1.7 billion between consolidated and joint venture sales. It's enormous for Cummins. Big part of the success in the last 5 years, very important part of our success going forward. Hence the concern when you hear all this rhetoric about let's put tariffs on Chinese tires. Because you know it's going to happen. You know what would happen if someone did it to us. We're going to fight back. So we need to stop the fighting. We need to start building relationships here. So from a Cummins perspective, the facts about the globalization or the facts about international free trade, for us, they're laid out here. Okay? We have reduced cyclicality. We're making money in the worst recession in our lifetime. Okay? We have access to new growth opportunities around the world. Continue to do so. We've just launched a 3.8-litre engine with a company called Photon in China. We're going to develop a 3.8 and a 2.8-litre engine that could get up to a couple of 100,000 engines a year in the next few years. New market for us. Tremendous opportunity for us. I talked about exporting $3.5 billion worth of product last year. I talked about creating new jobs, even though US sales US revenues are not growing. We still create jobs in the US. And there's no doubt it's allowed us to remain competitive. Where we have profitable growth, we're creating more jobs, and we're profitable. We're making money, we're paying dividends, our stakeholders are very happy with us. So that's the facts for Cummins. From a US manufacturing perspective, there's this perception that we've outsourced much of our manufacturing to low-cost countries, such as Mexico and China. The fact, though, is that US manufacturing still remains very strong. Okay? We have 22% of world manufacturing market share. That number's been pretty flat for the last 30 years, 22%. China's catching up. China has now gone to about 14 or 15% of the market share. And then Germany is lying in third place. Okay? But it's wrong to say US manufacturing is weak. Well, it's getting weak. It's not. It's strong. It's the strongest in the world. And in Indiana, it's very strong. Okay? Indiana, manufacturing contributed $64 billion worth to Indiana's GDP last year. Okay? 25% of the state GDP came from manufacturing, the largest of any state in the US. Okay, so this is not, just don't think of it as a US deal, think of it as Indiana too, right here. And these are some examples of foreign companies coming to the US and coming to Indiana. So you've got Honda coming to Greensburg. That's their 11th major plant in the US. US Honda plants and Acura plants now supply 76% of all their vehicles that's sold in the US. That number surprised me. It was a good number. Like the number. It means it's very good for US employees making cars to sell into US markets. The other examples, Isuzu going to Lafayette, Toyota going to Princeton. Foreign-based companies making products with American labor in the US for the US market. And foreign companies now, foreign headquartered companies now, employ about 2 million people in US manufacturing. So I hope you're starting to feel what's at stake here if we start rigging the game. And for the consumer, we've already talked about how more competition is good for us. More innovation, better products, more choice, lower cost. All good for us. All good for our standard of living. And then I think it's important to just say a few words about poverty and living standards. Just in India and China alone, in the last 10 to 15 years, 200 million people have been lifted out of poverty. I showed a number earlier on that covered a longer period and was worldwide, but just in the last 10 or 15 years, 200 million people has been lifted out of poverty, largely as a result of those countries having access now to a larger share of the free trade, international trade pie. So how can that be a bad thing? Are we that self-centered and selfish that all we think about is the US? Don't we have a responsibility to look out for everyone around the world? Because sometimes it feels like we don't. Sometimes it's like all we care about is right here, and we ignore everyone else. And I don't think that's right, and I don't think you think it's right either. Okay, so what should we do? We have to avoid protectionist policies. I think you've got the gist of that. We should be promoting the Doha trade talks, and we should be promoting more bilateral trade agreements that we currently have in place today. I think there are 6 steps. We think there are 6 steps that the administration needs to promote so we can fully reap the benefits of globalization and free trade. First, government, business, and the academic sector need to work together better than what they're doing today on R&D and on innovation. Okay? We're known as the best in the world. Okay? We can get complacent, and that will no longer be the case. China, India, some of the Asian tigers are investing more, their rate of growth on investments are faster than what we are investing here. Okay? So we have to come together because R&D innovation ultimately creates jobs. Secondly, immigration reform. It's a really touchy subject. We've got approximately 50 million people who are eligible to retire in the next 10 years. This country desperately needs immigration reform to attract and retain talent born outside the US. Okay, it's really, really important. I mean, if you look at what I like about the US is how it's managed to grow and mold in all these different people who have come from many, many different countries over the years and made it the country it is today. Bringing all that talent, all that knowledge, all that diversity. And it's like we think, okay, we've stopped that now. Let's turn it off. And I think that's a big mistake. I agree it has to be responsible immigration reform. Okay, but let's kind of get away from the nonsense that we don't need it anymore, because we do. Structural costs. This is another big deal for us. Okay, we put ourselves at a competitive disadvantage with the costs that US companies have to bear for healthcare. The corporate tax rate that we have is, if it's not the highest in the world, it's among the highest in the world. Everyone else is reducing their tax rate. We're not. We're going to increase it. We have excess regulation. We have frivolous lawsuits. We just kind of put ourselves at a disadvantage. And I think we've got to change that. We have to promote more free trade. We only have 14 or 15. The US only has 14 or 15 bilateral free trade agreements today. The new ones, as I said earlier on, are stalled in Congress. Europe has 23 bilateral trade agreements. Okay? And what you're seeing is that China, India, Brazil, countries in Europe and Africa are forming more free trade agreements. Now, the concern about the trade deficit that we have here, we actually have a trade surplus with those countries where we have a free trade agreement. So there has to be an incentive to start talking more with the other party and get rules around how we're going to trade together. Because I think that can go a long way to putting to bed these issues about free trade and open trade. The fifth issue is education reform. And the point I want to make here is that we have to improve our secondary education. We have to have more emphasis on math, on science and technology than what we have today. Our manufacturing industry depends on a very sophisticated level of manufacturing understanding, process understanding, technology understanding. Okay, so we have to make those investments in education more so than what we're doing today. And then we have to retrain displaced workers. We have to provide, maybe it's providing more unemployment benefit, more training benefits than what's available to them today, so they can then have the chance to move into new jobs in new industries. So there are difficult issues with international trade. There's no easy answers. It requires really understanding the facts, understanding what those facts mean to us. We have to communicate them better than what we're doing today. We have to be willing to compromise. We're not always going to be right. And we have to work better together with different countries around the world. If we don't do that, if we don't take on that challenge, then other people will take it away from us. Okay? Other countries are hungrier than what we are today. They're gaining market share. And we have to figure out a way to fight back there. And then Darwin made a comment everyone's seen before, that it's not the strongest that survives, it's not the most intelligent that survives, it's the ones who are most responsive or adaptive to change. Okay? The challenge that we've got here is that foreign competition legitimately is coming in and looking for our business. So we can say, no, can't do that. Let's build a wall. You stay there and we'll stay here. Okay? And that way we hurt ourselves in the long run, or we can embrace the challenge and turn that challenge or difficulty into an opportunity. We had our former president, Joe Lockery, who's an alumni at Notre Dame. I always used to listen to Joe, and any time we come with a problem, Joe would say, okay, turn it into an opportunity. How can you turn that challenge or difficulty into something that can really give you an advantage in the long run? Think about it differently. Don't think of it as a defeatist issue that's coming at you. And then I was trying to find a nice simple quote just to wrap up the international trade discussion, and this is the best one I could come up with. And it's probably a really good one, because I think as I've read up on US history and US presidents, he is certainly probably the most impressive one I've come across. The merchant has no country. The merchant has no country. Just give them the opportunity to sell. So, lastly, I just noticed I'm speaking far too long and not leaving time for questions. What is your role in this? Okay, what are you going to do? You're the next generation of business leaders. You're the next generation of maybe political leaders, maybe here, maybe somewhere else. Okay, so what are you going to do here? I think you have to start by understanding that you have an obligation to society. Okay, you need to look around the world and figure out what are you going to do in the next 25, 35 years to change society. Okay, don't wait for someone else to do it. You're some of the smartest people that we have in this country. Okay, so what are you going to do with the education and the talent that you have? How are you going to use that as a positive force to change society? I think the third point up here about striving for success but doing it in the right way goes back to ethics. You're going to hear more about that in your next session in this program, but it's really important that you do it the right way. There is no glory in cheating. There is no glory in rigging the game so you win and someone else loses. Seek opportunities where challenges arise or problems exist. Okay, just talked about that. Churchill had a comment that I've used in other presentations, that difficulties mastered are opportunities won. Okay, so seek out the challenge and take it on. Figure out how you make it win for yourself. And then don't compromise your ideals and your values. You're going to come under pressure after you leave here and you go out into the real world. People are going to put pressure on you to compromise, to change your beliefs, to change what you think is important. They're going to say you're naive. And I think what you have to say is, no, I'm not. And this is how I'm going to demonstrate to you what's important and why it's important. And then you can see the quote at the end there. Be the change that you want to see in the world. Don't look for someone else to do it. Okay? If you're not going to do it, if this highly intelligent group is not going to do it, I don't know who is going to do it. Okay? You have to take responsibility in your career to look out not just for yourself and your family, but for folks around the world. So, that's it. I apologize. Some of the slides in the early part of that presentation probably went a bit too long. It has been a real privilege to have the chance to come and talk to you today. I am happy to take any questions, whether it's on Cummins, free trade, or any other subject that you choose to shoot at me. So.
Okay, I know a few of you have appointments or classes that you have to get to, so if you have to leave, we understand. But for anyone who'd like to ask a question, please come forward to the microphone. In the meantime, I want to thank you very much, Pat.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
That was good.
I think that there's a lot of kids out there in this class.
Yeah.
For those of you that are going to lunch with Mr. Ward, please come forward.